All right. If you'll come on and have a seat. Now, just so that we can have a conversation, I want to encourage you to come and sit in the seats here. Now that your bladders are full, come on down and have a seat. We're very glad that you're here tonight on such a beautiful evening. I know that Randy Seitz over there, it looks like he went home from work and enjoyed the outdoors already. I'm surprised you could peel yourself away. Oh, okay. What a beautiful day. Let me introduce myself. There's some of you here that I haven't had the privilege to get to know you. My name is Aubrey Spears, and I'm the pastor of the Church of the Incarnation. It's an Anglican church that meets in town. And we're delighted tonight to have our discussion here in the buildings that belong to Alethia Church. Now, a number of people have worked very hard to make tonight happen, and I just want to point them out. And then at the end, we'll give them a round of applause as an expression of gratitude. First of all is Josh Defnell, who is somewhere. Here he is. Josh is the director of Café, Veritas. And as with our previous events, Josh has done an enormous amount of work to make this happen. But he's not been alone. As many of you know who've put on events before, it takes a lot more people than you can imagine to pull something like this off. So I'll just briefly mention the team that Josh worked with. There's Amelie Shepard, who's running around somewhere. Here she is, over here. Amelie and Luke Konefke, he's over here. And Mike Trainum is the one who puts posters up all over town. He's fearless about that. And Aaron Cook and, of course, Paul Fiske. And we just want to say thanks to all of you. Thanks to Paul and Alethia for generously hosting, and they provided the refreshments. Let's show them our gratitude for their labors. Thanks very much. Now, tonight is the fifth occurrence of Café Veritas. Café Veritas is an initiative that myself, along with a number of friends, began back in the fall. And we've covered issues like urban density, genocide and forgiveness, land ethics. We've looked at evidence for and against the historical reliability of the Christian gospel manuscripts. The whole purpose of Café Veritas is to expand and enlarge and engage our vision of what true life together looks like here in the valley. And we're going to do this, as we've been doing it throughout the fall and the spring, by exploring tough questions. So we've tried to identify really fecund topics that can open up into really meaningful discussions and conversations, and by thinking about the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. Now, the title for tonight is Broken Borders. A theologian and a lawyer lead a public discussion about Harrisonburg, illegal immigration, and mending fences. As many of you know, illegal immigrants live under darkening clouds of suspicion here in America. And when you combine our two-party political system with a culture that's grown accustomed to sound bites and to the politicization of everything, when you put those two issues together, you end up with opinions on this complex issue that are polarized and overly simplistic. In order to break through all of the sound bites, and in order to have a healthy and informative and a productive discussion on this issue, we've invited Aaron Cook and Paul Fiske to lead us in this topic tonight. Now, Aaron, I'll invite them up in just a moment, but to give you a sense of things, Aaron is a 1994 graduate of the University of Virginia Tech. Is that right? No, the other one. University of Virginia. I get them. I'm from Texas. They all look the same. From the University of Virginia School of Law. He served as an assistant Commonwealth's attorney for Harrisonburg and Rockingham County from 1995 to 2000. And then since 2000, he's been in private practice, primarily working in the areas of immigration and criminal defense. Aaron lives near Dayton with his wife, Paula, and their 4 children. Paul is a native of Harrisonburg, right? Yeah. Grew up here? Close. But you graduated from Harrisonburg, didn't you? Broadway. They all look the same to me. Paul is the pastor of this church, Alethia Church, and before coming to Alethia, he was a pastor of several churches in North Carolina. He lives here in Harrisonburg with his wife Kelly and their 2 sons. So here's the flow of how we'll have the discussion tonight. First, Aaron and Paul will speak for approximately 45 minutes. And after that, we're going to have a Q&A. I'll moderate the Q&A. I'll sit down for their part, and then I'll come back up. So while they're talking, be thinking of questions, writing them down, poking your neighbor, offering for them to ask the question. And then we'll have a period of question and answer time and discussion among ourselves. And then at the end of the evening, we'd love for you to stick around. There'll be coffee and water and more refreshments to continue the conversation in a more informal atmosphere. So with all of that, I invite Aaron and Paul to come on up, and we'll begin our discussion.
Thank you, Aubrey, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here once again. If you would like a pen, by the way, where is Katie? Katie, maybe if you could get up and help us with some pens. If you need a pen to jot down some questions, we really would like for you to do that. She'll probably have some pens right there in the back. If you need one, feel free to get up and grab a pen. I hope tonight will be a catalyst for all of us as we leave here to think a little bit more deeply about this issue of immigration, which has obviously become a hot topic in our country over the past couple of decades, at least in our minds probably, in the perspective of people in our generation. The debate over whether or not people should be crossing the borders, I think, has escalated at what seems to be an unprecedented level. And Aaron will speak to us in a few minutes about the history of this. We're bombarded with news about immigrants at just about every media outlet, and with people on both sides, weighing in very heavily. And it seems like every time we have a political race, this seems to be kind of at the forefront of what the candidates are talking about. And I think although many of us here in this room have differing opinions, probably we do, about the matter of immigration, the question is probably the same for all of us. What should we do? And this is a pretty broad question, I know. There's a lot of complexities involved as we ask that question. But what should we do? And I hope we can shed some light on that tonight. Again, my name is Paul Fiske. I'm the pastor here at Alethia Church. And as a Christian, the subject of immigration is a catalyst for the same question in my mind. What should we do? And when I think about that question, I tend to think of it in light of one of the highest commandments in the Bible, one that Jesus spoke of very frequently. Love your neighbor. And I begin to think about these two things, and you begin to try and reconcile what this looks like in your mind. It's difficult, too. It's a really deep question. In my opinion, love always has an action. In other words, it isn't necessarily neutral to anything. So tonight, in light of the subject of immigration, Aaron and I hope to engage in a discussion here on stage, followed by some Q&A with you all about what those actions might be. And hopefully at this point, Aaron can give us some insights on what immigration looks like on a broad scale, a national scale, and even more so what it looks like here in our city, our county, in the Shenandoah Valley here.
All right, I'll start, I guess, with a few stats just to kind of set the stage for us. In the United States 2010 census, there are 310 million people in the United States. 40 million of them were born outside the United States. And 33 million entered the country prior to 2005. Those are big numbers. Let's make it smaller. In Harrisonburg, we have a population in the city of about 49,000 people, according to the 2010 census. Of those people, 13% are foreign-born, and 19% live in a household where English, where a language other than English is spoken. That's a pretty staggering number. Almost 1/5 of households in Harrisonburg, there's a language other than English being spoken. Over a 10-year period from the census in 2000 to the census in 2010, the population of Harrisonburg increased by 21%. The number of foreign-born people in Harrisonburg increased by 114%. And now comprise about 16% of the city's population. Harrisonburg is kind of unique. If you look around Virginia, most places where there are that many foreign-born people are in the urban areas, in Northern Virginia, in Richmond. And Harrisonburg really is kind of a unique area as far as foreign-born populations. Some other statistics that I think are interesting. As of January 31st, 2012, 37% of city school students are in the ESL program, representing 47 different languages and 50 different countries where they were born. 76% of those students who are in the city schools and are in the ESL program, English is a second language. It's actually called Limited English Proficiency, but they've probably changed that since this meeting started. So 76% of those students speak Spanish, 7% Arabic, 6% Kurdish, 4% Russian. Here's another interesting fact. Of those students in the Harrisonburg City Schools who are in the ESL program, the English as a Second Language program, 64% were born in the United States, which means they're United States citizens. We can talk more about that. Probably lost most of you. Let's get back to prose. When lawyers talk about immigrants, there are really, generally speaking, 3 different ways that you can come to the United States legally. Actually, there's 4 different ways. Actually, there's 4.5 different ways. Okay. The first way, we lawyers actually call them non-immigrants. Non-immigrants are immigrants, are aliens, that's the legal word, who come to the United States with the intention to be here temporarily. So think tourists, think students. There are a lot of visas. You'll hear of folks who have a visa that has a letter in front of it, a K visa, an F visa, a J visa. Those are all what we call non-immigrants, and they're here temporarily. So that really isn't, we don't refer to that as immigration. The half of a way you can get here is each year 50,000 people are selected from a lottery from throughout the world to get permanent residence. And so it's a relatively small number. There are millions of applications. 50,000 people win the lottery and get residence. So leaving that 1.5 ways of getting here aside, there are actually 3 ways people generally can get to the United States. First is through employment. If there's an employment opportunity where an employer has a job available that he cannot find an American to do that job, then he can apply and go through a process to bring somebody from another country. In Harrisonburg, that is not a regular avenue for immigration. The second way that people can come to the United States is through what we call asylum. It's also, there's a refugee program, but let's call it asylum. It's for folks who are escaping persecution in their home country. Here in Harrisonburg specifically, back in the 1980s, we had a lot of folks coming from the Soviet Union to this area through the refugee resettlement program. In the 1990s and in the last 10 years, folks from Iraq, Iran, Eritrea, other Mideast countries are predominantly the folks who come to the United States, come to Harrisonburg through asylum. And then the third way is through family ties. There's a way that somebody who's here lawfully can apply to bring family members, not extended family members, but within their nuclear family. We've had immigration from the beginning. I mean, truly, we're a nation of immigrants. A couple things are always true. Immigrants tend to come in waves from places, and there's always been public policy debates about how to deal with new immigrants. It always feels to the current generation that that's something new, but it's really not. The latest wave coming from Central America, they came to escape war in the 80s, coming to escape extreme poverty since then, has resulted in a number of new laws that were designed to deal with this situation. Back in 1986, there was a pretty comprehensive, sweeping law that was passed that hasn't worked. 1996, it got much worse for immigrants. Both these laws were designed to put an end to, or at least put a dent in, illegal immigration, but they have not. Today, the best thing I can say about it is our politicians are paralyzed in what direction to go. Why is that? Because there's no easy answers. The problem has become so large that any change to the law will result in considerable and unknown collateral damage to the economy and to our culture and so forth. So it seems that in most public discussions on this topic of immigration, especially the issue of illegal immigration, it ends up being a discussion about public policy. What should the U.S. government do about this? I hope our discussion tonight is about more than public policy. For starters, nobody in this room can really do anything about it. I would like to see us spend our time tonight assuming that things are going to continue as they are. We have a growing immigration population in our community. Many of them are undocumented. And I would like to see us ask the question, what obligations do we have, those of us in this room, to the members of our community who are immigrants, and what is our obligation to undocumented immigrants as well?
Thanks, Aaron, for sharing that. One of the things you mentioned is that there are no easy answers, and that any changes will result in considerable and unknown collateral damage to the economy and to our culture. That's kind of an astounding statement there. In my mind, before we can really engage this topic at a deep level, we've got to understand it at an anthropological level. And what I mean by that is the discussion must be rooted in the idea that the center of immigration is an issue about humanity, about culture, about society. And as a Christian, I embrace the idea that humanity was created in the image of God. And so in the Genesis account, the Bible records that God created everything and declared that it was good, even very good. And in this account, God created a garden, Eden. And he created man in his own image and placed man in the garden. This, by the way, was the only creature that was described like that, in his image. And what this means for those of us who embrace creationism is that there was something special, something very unique about this creature that had that title, in the image of God. Since the Bible links the image of God with the exercise of dominion over all of the living creatures of the sea, of the heavens, of the earth, one can see that humanity is endowed here with the authority to rule the earth as God's representative, based on the Genesis account again. Some scholars, seeing the pattern of male and female here in this account, have concluded that humanity expresses God's image, particularly in relationships, but really in well-functioning relationships. in human community, both in marriage and then on a broader spectrum in our society as well. But traditionally, the image has been seen as the capacities that set man apart from all of the other created things that we see there early in Genesis. Ways in which humans resemble God, such as the characteristics of reason, for example, characteristics of morality, language, capacity for relationships governed by love and commitment, creativity, and all forms of art. That list could really go on. All of these insights can be put together by observing that the resemblances of man are like God. Man is like God in a series of ways. These allow us to, this allows mankind to represent God in ruling and to establish worthy relationships with God, with one another, and with the rest of creation. That's really important. This idea of being in the image of God allows us to establish those relationships. Essentially, Adam, the first human, the first one who was created in the image of God, according to the Genesis account, was designed to continue the work that God had begun as God's image bearer. The mandate that was given by the Creator to Adam was twofold there early in the book of Genesis. So, number one, subdue the earth and have dominion over it. Literally, responsibly develop my created world. And number two, be fruitful and multiply, procreate. Spread over the earth, over the face of the earth. Fulfilling the first mandate is how we represent the Creator, while the second is how we expand the representation of this Creator. And the reason I think that this is the root of the issue is because what this means is that everyone that has ever been born is a descendant of this man Adam, again, according to the Genesis account, and therefore inherits this very same mandate, again, as the image bearer of the Creator, regardless of race, color, creed, socioeconomic, dynamic, whatever that might be. Everyone who's living and breathing is there as the image bearer of the Creator. Our forefathers, by the way, weren't way off base when they penned the unalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence as being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This revolved around the ethical ideas of work, cultural development, benefit to society, existing for and coming from every single human being. This was, in their minds, this existed for everyone. This is the land of opportunity. And this is why our forefathers came to this land, because they saw it as a place of opportunity. And so as we begin to think about this issue at a deeper level, it must be thought of in the scope, or must be looked at through the scope that in reality everyone has the same tie. And Aaron, maybe you can help us understand as we think about this, why do people, why do they come to America? I think that sometimes maybe we think lightly about this. They're just kind of coming and crossing the borders or whatever it might be. But in my mind, as other image bearers who maybe don't physically look like me, but people who bear the image of the Creator that I worship, why do they come here? And what's the price they pay for coming? What are they looking for? And what kind of sacrifice are they making as they cross the border?
I guess as I answer this question, I just want to be clear about something, and that is we do have a lot of folks from different countries, from different areas of the world in Harrisonburg. Most folks who come from Europe and Africa and Asia are documented. They have permission to be here. It's not 100% true, but it's as a rule, and you can understand why, right? Because they have to come through a port or an airport or to actually arrive physically in the country. So when we talk about illegal or undocumented immigrants, we're talking about people primarily from Central America. And so even though not every undocumented immigrant who is in Harrisonburg is from Central America, I'm going to speak that way, okay, because that's primarily true. So I'll answer your question. I'll talk about, from my experience, why they come, how they got here, and a little bit about what life is like in Harrisonburg. And I'll say I have this information from firsthand accounts. I spent a lot of time counseling in my job as a lawyer, individuals and families who are undocumented, who do not have permission to be here. And each story is unique, and yet there's some patterns that you see developing. People come primarily these days for jobs, for opportunity. 20 years ago, there were wars going on in Central America that were pushing people out of their homes, and they ended up in the United States. But today, it's primarily opportunity. Now, as a general rule, from the folks I've talked to, people would stay at home if they had any sort of opportunity at home, even a small opportunity to provide for their family, to provide a future for their children. They'd much rather be at home. So, as I talk about life in Harrisonburg for an undocumented immigrant, it makes me pause and wonder, what must it be like at home for them to say, I'm going to Harrisonburg, or I'm going to the United States? Because they would much rather, as a general rule, be at home. Most folks who come from Central America come across the desert. It's a couple days' journey. You pay about $2,000 to somebody that is referred to as a coyote. I don't understand why, but that's what they call them. A coyote is a person who has contacts on this side, and it's arranged different ways, but folks end up paying a coyote to lead them across the desert. That trip is dangerous. Not only do people die, but I've never actually, I've rarely heard of a story that ended where it went smoothly. So many stories of folks halfway across, the coyote quits and goes back, and they're kind of on their own to kind of find the next connection. It's usually a series of stops in houses where they stop for a few days and somebody else comes and gets them. Occasionally they come across in the back of a truck, the back of a car, but most folks I talk to actually walk across the desert into Arizona, into Texas. And then if they're not caught by immigration, and if they actually make it across, to get to Harrisonburg is another enormous venture or adventure. Most folks who come to Harrisonburg have a friend or family members here, that they know that they can get a place and they can get a job. When you really think about the miles that have to be covered to get from Honduras or El Salvador or Mexico to Harrisonburg, it's quite an accomplishment. I'm not sure I could start out on foot and make it, but many do. So whenever folks arrive in Harrisonburg, a lot of times that's the first time they really understand that they need to get false papers. And for many folks, they don't, well, let me say this, culturally, and I don't fully understand it, but culturally for a person from Central America, this idea of false papers or identity does not carry with it the same sort of moral weight that we give it here in the United States. It's not the same level of criminal activity to obtain a document that has somebody else's name on it. It's usually presented to them as this is what you have to do to get work, and so they do. If folks work here in Harrisonburg, they typically have papers that either are entirely false or were taken from or sold by somebody so that they can have a valid name and Social Security number. It presents for interesting situations. Just this week, a couple different folks in my office who had an identification that apparently was being used by several other people throughout the country, maybe many other people throughout the country. So if you can imagine, somebody takes Ernie's identification, copies it, sells it, and then suddenly there's 20 people named Ernie Dito who are working. The IRS, one fellow was in my office this week, the IRS had contacted him and said that he owed another $25,000 in taxes because of all the different places he was working throughout the country. Another individual this week who had a child support judgment against him in California, and he'd never been to California. And the dilemma is, do I pay it? Do I contact them and say, this isn't me? It's a real dilemma for folks to know kind of how to deal with that. The worst thing is when a client is arrested or is pulled over here in Harrisonburg for speeding, and he's wanted in New York for murder. That's always a tough situation. Other things for folks here in Harrisonburg, it is not unusual for an employer to hire someone that they know to be undocumented. They'll say, we'll pay you every 2 weeks on Friday. First payday comes, and they say, we'll get you a check next week. So they come back the next week, and they say, where's my check? And the employer says, never mind, you don't work here anymore. And where folks do labor and they're not paid. That happens more often than we'd like to think. Victims of domestic assault, for example. Do you call the police on your husband or do you not? Husband is assaulting his wife. He's angry. He's drunk. The police need to be called. If the police are called, he will probably be deported. And it puts that often that lady in a very difficult position. Many young people who graduate from Harrisonburg High School who have no identification and they have no opportunity to get employment, limited opportunities to go to college. So life in Harrisonburg for folks who are undocumented can be very difficult. And I'll let you talk for a while.
Wonderful. Would you say, Aaron, that this is the most easily exploited area, maybe in our community, not just our community even, but even in our country? I mean, these are an easy people group to exploit, right? So
that's
at
right.
many levels.
If an individual is not paid for their work, for example, should they sue? Part of the lawsuit is, I don't have permission to work. And there's some fear that trying to collect a $200 check will expose you to deportation. Or, the police officer arrives to investigate a burglary or a robbery or a theft or assault and battery. Will the police officer start inquiring about the victim's status? And they do. So it's a legitimate fear. So as a result, many abuses go unreported. The folks we count on to kind of protect us and help keep criminals at bay are not available to undocumented immigrants.
And even, and I'm thinking a little bit specific here. You've got an undocumented immigrant who works 20 or 30 years in the States. Does that happen? They work for 20 or 30 years as an undocumented immigrant with falsified papers.
Sure.
They come to retirement age. They've been paying taxes, but no Social Security on the back end for that individual. Is that correct?
That's right. They're not people who are undocumented are not eligible for Social Security benefits, any sort of welfare benefits. If they have a job that's paid cash under the table, they haven't paid in unless they've filed taxes, which many do, because if the opportunity were to come for a person to become documented, one of the questions is, have you been paying taxes all along? So some undocumented people who get cash under the table still pay taxes. Undocumented individuals who are working under a false name at a poultry plant or at a business that pays them a paycheck, they pay into the system, but will not, unless the law changes, will not ever be able to collect that.
As we think about the people who come in, of course we've been referring to those who come in as immigrants. This is a term that's very familiar to all of us. Foreigners even is a term that's familiar. Aliens, strangers, all things that we've kind of heard, understood, or spoken about at some level, if not tonight, before tonight. And typically we view the people who come in as different, even though their desire to provide, their desire to prosper, their desire to have success is much the same as ours, much the same as most of us in here, which is quite the irony considering we're the melting pot of the world. Should we view those who come in as different? I think at some level this is natural. People look different. They speak a different language. There are all sorts of different cultural nuances. But how should we, in our community, we're starting to address the question here, how should we respond to the immigrants, the foreigners, the stranger, if you will? It's interesting to me that God often speaks of the immigrant, the stranger, in the Old Testament. And what this shows me is that even in ancient times, this idea of migration, immigration, if you will, isn't a new concept. It's not something that's foreign to the world or societies. The idea of the outsider, the foreigner, the stranger, the immigrant in the Old Testament comes primarily from 3 Hebrew words, and I've only begun to study this, and so my study up to this point on this has been very limited, but very eye-opening, very enlightening as well. But let me kind of throw out there to you what I've come up with and some thoughts that I have regarding this idea of stranger, this idea of immigrant from the Old Testament. The first Hebrew word that we would want to look at is this word ger. It's been translated as stranger, sojourner, alien, even foreigner in the Old Testament. It's been translated from the Abraham and Isaac narratives in the book of Genesis. And again, we're in the book of Genesis. We learn that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as they traveled, they had to negotiate treaties and agreements to sojourn in the territory and obtain water rights from the local people in the land through which they were traveling. You can see this all throughout the book of Genesis, namely, or most notably in Genesis 20, 21, and 26. But also Pharaoh in Egypt gave Joseph, the son of Jacob, who was a stranger, by the way, in Egypt, permission for his family to sojourn in Egypt in Genesis 45 when there was a famine. And when the family arrived to Egypt, the brothers asked Pharaoh for permission to sojourn in Egypt with their flocks. There again, the word is ger, the Hebrew word. From these and numerous other references, we can conclude that this idea of ger was a foreigner who comes to live in another land with permission of the host or permission of the proper authority. And that seems to be the trend in the Old Testament as you read through these things, that this is someone who maybe got permission from the host or from the proper authority. At least in my estimation, that's what it appears. The word foreigner, however, comes from 2 other Hebrew terms, namely zar and nechar. And in the Old Testament, this was someone who came to live in another land without the permission of the host or the proper authority, something that we're speaking about tonight. The Old Testament law insists that once a foreigner attained ger status in Israel, he was to be treated like a native-born Hebrew. You can see this in Exodus, again in Leviticus. Enjoying legal protection, social benefits, religious inclusion. The law, however, does not necessarily offer the same protection and benefits to the foreigner. This one I just described, nechar and zar. For example, an Israelite was not allowed to charge interest to someone who had attained ger status, but could to someone who was a foreigner. Leviticus and Deuteronomy chronicle this. Similarly, the ger, the one who had come into the land and attained this right from the host or the proper authority, could participate in Passover, while the foreigner was not necessarily allowed to do this. Again, in Exodus, you can read this. The distinction seems to demonstrate that the foreigner and the alien did not necessarily have the same standing in biblical. That's at least what it appears. I'm not totally sure, but does this mean that we can apply these observations? As we observe this, as we look at this from the Old Testament, does that mean that we can apply these observations to our current immigration dilemma? Can we look at that and draw a correlation between ger of the Old Testament and legal immigration today, and the foreigner of the Old Testament and illegal immigration today? And that was something that kept kind of going through my mind as I looked at these things. To be honest, I'm not totally sure. I do believe, however, that the Bible and the biblical laws definitely urge us to help incorporate foreigners who are here legally, and I think we could all agree on that, especially because even those are sometimes easily exploited. But what about the ones who are here illegal and maybe have been here for years, who obviously are the ones who are most exploited? In my estimation, again, as a Christian, I do not believe that we aren't supposed to also help that one who has arrived, who is here, who is among us, even if he or she is not here legally. And hopefully as we kind of get to this, Aaron, maybe you can help us out with the idea of why some of these immigrants are here illegally. Why are there so many? Why is it so difficult for people who come in to get papers?
Well, let me muddy the waters a little bit.
Okay.
I think the thing when I started doing immigration law that surprised me the most and continues to surprise me is that for this Central American worker that I've been talking about for the last few minutes, there is no way that person can get permission. I'll say that again. There is no way that person can get permission to come. So every time you hear a politician say, well, they just need to go home and come legally, that's nonsense under current law. Our immigration law, I was like looking at the poem at the Statue of Liberty, you know, the one that's got at the base. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I'm not sure what that meant in 1883 or whenever that was penned, but it certainly doesn't apply to immigration now. If you are a supermodel, or if you're a doctor, or if you're a nurse, or if you've got something we want, there is probably a path for you to come to the United States legally. If you are a Central American worker, there is no path. There is no valid status that you can obtain to enter the United States, or if you're here without permission, that you can now apply for to get permission to stay. That's staggering to me because, quite frankly, Harrisonburg's economy depends on those folks being here. To the extent we are a poultry, to the extent we are an agricultural area, those plants rely on, if you have ever gone into Cargill or any of these plants that have these production lines, you know that it's predominantly Hispanic, Spanish-speaking individuals. And I'll just tell you that they are predominantly undocumented. To the extent any of these, and I'm stereotyping, these Central American workers have permission, they got it one of two ways. One, part of the 1986 bill that was designed to stop illegal immigration, it provided an amnesty provision for individuals who'd been here for several years. There was a way they could register and get permanent residence. And the folks who have residence now, have permission now, obtained it either through that amnesty or their father did, or I guess now grandfather did, and they've been able to bring their families along. So that amnesty is why most folks who have a status here in Harrisonburg have a status. The second thing is something called TPS, Temporary Protected Status. It's a fiction that we've created that says if there is a natural disaster in your homeland. So think of the January 2000, was it 10 or 11? 2010 earthquake in Haiti. We declared that to be the United States government said this is the sort of catastrophe that anybody who is Haitian and here on that day, we will give them temporary protected status. Temporary protected status gives them permission to work. Temporary protected status is not really a status, notwithstanding its name. It says we will not deport people who were here without permission on that day, because if we were to deport everybody, it would cause even more problems for Haiti. So, as a friendly gesture to Haiti, we will not deport folks who are here that day. So you can't come 2 days later and take advantage of it. The fiction is that gets renewed every 18 months. So anybody who had it that day, so for example, back in the 90s, there was an earthquake in, was it El Salvador? Every 18 months, TPS status for those folks is renewed because we say they haven't cleaned up from it yet. And so every 18 months, people who were here at the time of that earthquake continue to get permission to work. So, long story. There's two ways Central Americans who have status have received it. One, TPS. Two, the amnesty. Beyond that, there's no path for folks to get permission. And so what's important about that to me is I think we have to consider that, because whose fault is that? It's our fault. We have not given them a pathway to obtain permission. Therefore, I think it's wrong for us, it's morally wrong for us to then condemn them for not having a status. So I'm sure that you have questions about that. What was your other question?
There's a few of them here. Maybe some of them will come up in just a couple minutes. It's just astounding to me that there is no pathway, which makes it difficult then for me, Aaron, to take these Old Testament laws that we just spoke about and make a correlation to what's going on in modern day, because the foundation of those laws is different than the foundation of what we have going on, because we don't have a pathway, as you just described. I'll throw another one out to you.
Okay.
I'm going to conclude in just a minute. We'll get to some Q&A. And you said it earlier, Aaron, but what, in my mind, if you could maybe you can't narrow this down, what policies do need to change to even move this effort forward, or is that not even possible?
Well, the problem is we have anywhere from 7 to 20 million people in the United States who are undocumented. When you're talking about numbers that large, any change in policy at a federal level will have kind of collateral effects that we can't even imagine. Let me give you an example. I'm stereotyping again. Back in the late 90s, typical Central American male who came to Harrisonburg. This is kind of the way it would work. Man would come for 6 months, work at a local poultry plant. He would then return home, meet his brother or cousin halfway, give him the papers. The brother or cousin would then come, sleep in the same trailer, work at the same spot on the line with the same identification, work for 6 months. And so each of these men would be able to work for 6 months, obtain more than enough money he needs for his family back home. And so he'd go back home and live for 6 months with his family. After the tragedy of September 11, 2001, we decided we needed to stop illegal immigration. So we tripled border security. A lot of federal money went into stopping immigrants at the border. Did the number of illegal immigrants go down? Absolutely not. In fact, it skyrocketed. If you look at Number of English as second language students in Harrisonburg. Back in 97, it was 6%. 2000, it was 10%. 2001, 18%. By 2005, it was 34%. What happened? By making it more difficult to cross the border, the effect was people came and stayed, and they brought their families. So now, instead of these men kind of coming back and forth and working as needed, they moved in, and they brought their families, and their children started going to school. Does that make sense? So the policy was we're going to stop illegal immigration, and the effect was we got more. And so any change to policy, whether it's, give them all amnesty and let them come in, or send them home, are going to have ramifications that are difficult for us to predict and are going to be devastating to the economy. So as a result, I think our politicians are paralyzed. They don't know what to do, so they're doing nothing, which also isn't an answer.
So these children who are coming are the same children who will go through Harrisonburg High School, graduate, and then nothing, right?
That's right. Now, as the families stay here and get established, the wave of children who are in elementary schools now were born here. So they're citizens. The political party that figures out that those folks will all be 18 at some point and able to vote and can come up with some sort of solution may have their vote for a long time. So hasn't happened yet, but maybe that will drive an answer.
Yeah, come on up, Aubrey. As you come up, I'll conclude. Well, go ahead. Come on up, and we'll get to some Q&A. And I was going to conclude here. I think some of these things will continue to come up through the Q&A.
Okay. Thanks, guys, very much. Obviously, they've worked hard and prepared for us to have a meaningful dialogue. So what we'll do is just raise your hand, identify yourself or an assumed name, whatever works for you. Is that bad? And I'll call on you. And if you want to address your question to a person in particular or to either, that'll be fine. Yes, Basil, tell us your name.
We don't need them because the lines are full. And it would be for a company like Cargill to say we need workers would subject them to all sorts of federal penalties if they admitted that the folks on the line were not documented. So as it turns out, because immigration follows jobs, passing laws just changes the percentage of folks who are documented. Immigration will follow jobs. It's fallen off the last 5 years. There's a significant drop in number of immigrants across the country, illegal immigrants across the country, and here in Harrisonburg. But the answer is we don't need them because they're here.
Aaron, can you clarify, what does the law use to identify a person as worthy of working here? But there's a way of identifying that person, right? They've got a degree. I mean, aren't there some sort of qualifications that make them able to be here because they're not taking a job that American would get? Or isn't there something like that?
Well, there's all different ways that can be determined. But just speaking generally, an employer can identify the sort of person they're looking for, can offer what is called the prevailing wage, which is actually a pretty high wage, can advertise for that job, And if no qualified individual comes and applies for that job, then they can go look somewhere else. But it's typically, in my experience, pretty high wage, and in the economy now. So if you think of, a mason or a plumber or a line worker or anything, if you advertise the job, it's going to get filled. So for under the current economic situation, it's really hard for that sort of a job to be certified as a job for which you can go outside the United States. And the Department of Labor sends in dummies to make sure you're actually going to hire people. So.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Ernie Dito. I'm one of the Ernie Ditos around. And we lived in Guatemala for a couple of years. And I'll just give you two ever so brief case examples so you can understand the cultural context of people coming up. One is we started adopting our son Luke, a wee little baby. And many people were free to give us counsel and advice that, well, don't pay all those silly lawyer fees and all that. Head on down to the local municipality. Christians and church people, folks, well respected in the community. Head on down to the municipality and sign them up and say, that's your baby. Katrina and I, white people. They're like, well, isn't there a little issue there? No. Besides, they'll soon adapt their skin color to your color after a while, someone say. And that's often was the mentality. You just do it. Second thing, often in the villages that we lived in, they would have services. The pastors would have services blessing these guys as they head out the door to the great white north and the coyotes. And it was a very formal process that would happen. And very much condoned in the community and in the church. So my question is, with that kind of context and with your background, what are there, if any, responses by the church on this side of the border that you know of or aware of that have addressed this in a healthy and responsible way and working with the illegal immigrants? Are there churches where there are examples like this, where they are trying to tackle this in a way that's navigating this thing?
I can speak from my world, which you're allowed to answer that.
I'm just the moderator.
Most, in my tradition, most churches are actually a little bit scared to address the issue. Even so much to the point that they're afraid to maybe reach out and even meet the needs of those people who might be the poorest or the most needy among us. They just kind of pull back. They're a little nervous. They don't quite know what to do. And I don't know. I really think it's because they don't really know what their role might be.
There are several churches here in this area who have welcomed Spanish-speaking congregations into their church. There are some places I know of where there are two separate churches, but they share a building. Some churches have hired Spanish-speaking pastors and have developed, made room in their lives for congregations to spring up, and some are actually getting quite large. I think it's great to see. Although it's interesting, this week I talked to a few folks, kind of preparing for tonight, just kind of saying a few things, seeing what the response would be. And one individual from a church very close by, I asked him the question. I said, if I were to tell you that 80% of the Spanish-speaking congregation in your church is undocumented, how would you feel about that? And he said, you think so? You think that they're 80% undocumented? I said, I'd bet a large amount of money on it. He was quite concerned. By the end of the conversation, indicated he was going to go to the leadership of the church and talk to him about it. So hopefully that ministry will continue, because it's touched a lot of lives. But I know the Catholic Church has a large very large Spanish-speaking congregation, as does Grace Covenant and Covenant Presbyterian and Nazarene Church and some smaller churches around as well. And so to that extent, I think the local church has done a pretty good job welcoming folks and providing for them.
Yes.
My name is Michael Fikema, and I just moved here this summer from South Dakota, which is why I got here so late, because I couldn't find this place. Bing knows nothing about it on the internet, I can tell you that. But I think that the Catholic Church has taken some very strong positions supporting the rights of immigrants, including bishops that have taken very strong positions. And I think that their perspective is that the right to life is a higher right than the question of the control over borders, because they recognize that that's what's motivating people coming here, is that their economies have become disasters. I mean, I since I got here late, I don't know if you talked about this or not, but that one of the things is the effect that the North American Free Trade Act has had upon Mexican agriculture, and it's essentially because it allowed cheap, subsidized U.S. corn to be imported into Mexico that the Mexican corn is unable to compete with, that's grown by peasants and so on. About 2 million peasants have been driven off of the land. And when that happens, the only place they can go is to the cities and try and get a job, but they don't have jobs in the cities either in the economy of Mexico, partly because a lot of the jobs have been destroyed by the invasion of American companies into Mexico because of this treaty. So they really have no alternative to migrate to the United States, in part because of trade policies that we have really imposed on Mexico. So there's a bit of a hypocrisy here, in that if you really were serious about addressing migration, you would change the trade policies between the United States and Mexico so that the Mexican economy could create jobs in Mexico. And I think this is what the Mexican people would like to see. But too few Americans see the link between these trade policies and what really amounts to forced migration. And so they're really doing the only thing they can to protect to defend their families, and the Catholic Church has recognized that's a higher moral priority. And I know in South Dakota, and I'm not as familiar with this area with respect to this, but in South Dakota there were organizations that have been set up by various religious orders, nuns, specifically to address the needs of migrants, including their need for legal assistance and so on, when they're in situations where they may be deported and there's ICE raids going on and sort of thing. So, but I think that's a really important factor, and if you want to look into that a little bit more, if you just put roots of immigration or roots of migration and Witness for Peace on the internet, they've done a 20-minute documentary where they actually went and visited the people in their home villages in Mexico and talked to them. They really go into this issue, and the human dimension of it really comes out. It's a very powerful documentary, and I really encourage you to check it out.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks very much. Yes.
My name is Stephen. My question is, how many of the undocumented are professionals? The context is that during the day, part of my profession is to teach English to the immigrants. And in a typical classroom, I'll have microbiologists, attorneys, and engineers. And I will also have laborers and unskilled laborers, some with some trade skills. And so again, my question is, how many of the undocumented people believe are the professionals, such as the attorneys and so forth?
I don't have any solid numbers on that. Of course, there's not many solid numbers on many of these issues. As far as the folks that come in my office, by far, the majority of folks have an 8th grade education. They can read and write in Spanish, and their education isn't beyond that. But that being said, we do have a number of folks who are here doing labor jobs because that's all they can do with their status, who have advanced degrees and who have professions and who are accountants and that sort of thing. But they're here doing labor because it's the only opportunity they have. And it surprises me, but it happens more often than you think. I'm sorry, I'm not the moderator.
Is there a female who would have a question to take over this? Yes, in the turquoise, right behind Barbara. Yes. Tell us your name again.
I'm Kate.
Okay.
I'm a senior at JV. Practically speaking, what are some things that we can do as the Harrisonburg community for the immigrant population? Because we obviously can't change policy ourselves.
Right.
It's quite a broad question.
So, Paul, you spent time preparing for this as a Christian pastor, looking at Scripture. And in the Old Testament, there are very practical ways to respond to the foreigner, the alien, the sojourner, the immigrant. Did any ideas come to your mind about practical ways that you could respond, or that the community of people you're involved with that could respond?
Yeah, I think at a very basic level, with as I was looking through this and studying this, at a very basic level, it's just sharing life with these people, being hospitable, inviting them into your life, into your world, being a part of their life, being a part of their world, not separating yourselves for fear that, gosh, this might be an undocumented immigrant or something, but really inviting them in, being a part of what they're doing. I think at a very basic, very practical level, as individuals, as families, that's the most basic thing we can do.
Aaron? I know that you've been dealing with people professionally, but surely, I know just from knowing you personally, over the past number of years, surely there have been ways you've been provoked to respond on a personal level.
Yeah, I think that just getting to know if someone is part of your life, or your paths cross, just getting to know a family, getting to know several families who are immigrants, whether or not they're documented, is a really great thing. Just becoming part of their lives, and soon they will bring you in, and you'll become part of their friends' lives. Another thing is there are certain places in this area where the community is largely Hispanic or largely immigrant, and just being able to go there and hang out at the playground and play soccer and those sorts of things are great ways to get involved. I know that I see Sandy Mercer here. She works at the high school, and she has become involved with a number of different families' lives through the students at the high school. And I'm not sure you have to go out of your way, but for most of us, as part of our lives, part of our work, part of what we do, our lives intersect, and not shying away from people, but just welcoming them and being open to them. They want that connection too.
Barbara. Wait, Paula, were you going to add on to that? Hold on. Can you hear Barbara? Okay, Barbara, they can't hear you. Can you maybe...
There's places like, I'm Barbara. There's places like Skyline Literacy where you can help teach English to people that don't know English well. And they have a lot of programs. There's New Bridges. We have a lot of nonprofits in this area that reach out to the immigrant population. So that's something else we can do. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I would also tack onto that. There's the Refugee Resettlement Office that is physically located in the basement of the Lutheran Church on Market Street, but they are looking for volunteers to help assimilate new families. They're usually asylees or refugees who are being brought here. They're always looking for folks to help them understand how to shop and how to get around town, and how to flush the toilet and all the stuff that they need to learn when they arrive here.
So is the scenario there, and I think, Basil, you've been involved in this, don't they, not going to forget you, Barbara, when a refugee family gets here, they're immediately connected with the family who can show them the ropes, right?
That's right.
Everything from how to flush a toilet to, right? This is very easy. It's stuff that we have as tacit knowledge, right, that we can then offer to a very vulnerable family. Barbara.
And what I would add, the thing you find out is that everybody's just like us. They just want a nice place for their family to grow up. That's what you end up finding out when you get to know these people. They're just like us. They're like everybody.
I'll never forget a headline I saw in the Daily News Record maybe 8 years ago now. It was, survey reveals day workers are churchgoers, comma, family men, which I thought was a striking headline.
And the emergency room. Yeah.
But I would really interested to find out if anybody has found out how much Social Security is not being collected. I wonder if those numbers balance out or even surpass.
There are all sorts of studies that I've seen kind of using those numbers, but every study has a bias. And so you'll see them on both sides, and I certainly don't have the knowledge to sort that out.
Gil in the back.
Everybody says that.
Gil, where did you immigrate from? Yes, sir. In the red shirt here.
Yeah, I'm Sam Miller, and I have a brother-in-law in Central Florida. They manage about a 400-acre fruit farm, and they grow vegetables. And every season, they bring hundreds of Mexicans, and they have a quota, and they put them up in their apartments that they rent, and they give them work for these months. And then when it's over, they all go home and take their money, and they do what you were describing used to be years ago. Now, why can't Cargill or a new company or one of the corporate companies here do that here?
That's a very good question. There is a temporary visa. We talked about at the beginning about non-immigrants. There is a temporary visa for seasonal agricultural work. Cargill does not have seasonal agricultural work. They slaughter turkeys and package turkeys year-round. Therefore, they do not qualify for that particular visa. The apple orchards used to bring in a lot of folks in the Winchester area and Woodstock on that sort of visa. It's a migrant worker visa. And quite frankly, and what people would do is they'd come and they would follow the harvest, I guess, from Maine or up north down south every fall and harvest apples. But that visa is not available for the poultry industry or the beef industry or most of the work that we have here in Harrisonburg. There is no easy fix, but it seems good to me.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question because I've got a microphone. So as a Christian, there's Romans 13, obey the law of the land. I hear a lot of Republican politicians, speaking stereotypically, who are appealing to the Christian right, using that language to advocate tougher immigration response to illegal immigrants. On the Christian left, you often hear rhetoric that taps into the Christian tradition of civil disobedience. Both of these are rooting themselves in Scripture, one in the love of neighbor, one in obeying the law. Both are appealing to Scripture to authorize their addressing of this situation. It's funny to me that many of those who advocate Romans 13 also valorize Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is one of the paradigms of civil disobedience. So you begin to scratch at the surface and it gets fairly twisted. The Christian tradition, like Paul has already said, is not clear on this issue. It doesn't give us a straight way forward. So asking you two guys, I know who both are Christians, how do you navigate between these things, between the respect for the law of the land and the Christian tradition of civil disobedience when the law of the land violates more basic laws like love of neighbor? So how do we think through this on those terms?
That's a broad question as well, one that I thought about a lot. You know, you think about the passage in Romans, be subject to every authority. And of course, having grown up in a home where we have those thought processes from a really far right-wing Christian family, you hear this kind of stuff all the time. In my mind, this gentleman right over here said it perfectly. Was it Michael, I believe? The law of life is a higher law. Everyone is, as I mentioned a little while ago from the Christian tradition, is an image bearer of God, not just those of us who are here in America. That's everyone. And viewing these people as actually seeking, in some cases, looking for life itself, because there are no opportunities, there are no jobs, there's nothing. And so the essence of life is almost, at some level, unattainable where they are. And so they come north. And wasn't Jesus considered to be disobedient according to the Jewish law?
So is it fair to say that you are saying on this issue, civil disobedience?
I'm saying that it seems like there is a higher law.
Okay. Eric?
Well, let me make the issue even more muddier.
As an officer of the court, what are you advocating? No.
I do think it's very clear how we respond to those who are already here.
Okay.
Let me make the issue even muddier. We have an ICE office, Immigration and Customs Enforcement office in Harrisonburg. It's located, it's a secret place, so don't tell anybody. It's right next door to Jalisco Restaurant, ironically enough. It's the nondescript brick building with the barbed wire around it, and it is a QRT, quick response team. Their job is to deport folks in Harrisonburg who are undocumented. They came in 8 years ago or so, and we were very concerned about what this was going to do to Harrisonburg. It turns out it's really done nothing. All they do is deport people from the jail who have funny last names. They do not go to any of the poultry plants. They do not go to any of the neighborhoods where we know immigrants live. I'm not sure what they do all day, and I'm fine with that, but it makes me wonder, is it really the law? You know, I mean, if they were serious about deporting people, they could very quickly either cause deportations to happen or cause what we call euphemistically self-deportations to happen. And that is, you show up at one shift. Well, it was 98 or so, there was some sort of a raid at one of the plants where they showed up, they arrested almost an entire shift downtown Harrisonburg. The next shift didn't show up to work, and the manager said there must have been some sort of flu or, you know, something had happened where, like, the entire shift was sick. What happens? Well, when one shift gets deported, the next shift and the next shift doesn't show up to work. So if they were serious about this law, they could enforce it. There are very good reasons why they don't enforce it. Good economic policy reasons why people are not being deported. But when that's the case, it makes me wonder, in answer to your question now, it makes me wonder, is this a real law? You know, it's like the speed limit. We all know that if it's a 65 miles an hour speed limit, you're probably not going to get arrested if you're going 70, right? So I've seen Pastor Aubrey speeding before.
On my feet?
I think that, like I said, muddies the waters even more. When we talk about we must be a nation of laws and we must enforce the law. Really? I mean, we're not enforcing it. So why should we take some sort of rigid, legalistic approach in our lives whenever the government's not doing it?
Oh, hold on. Let me. Yes, in the back.
Did I say that? No, I'm just kidding. I might have said harder. I think it's harder for me to get really judgmental on that issue. You didn't take the right steps. Oh, well, then I want to take the right steps. Well, there are no right steps. I think it clouds the issue for me.
Yes, ma'am.
Does that mean the Hindus and the Buddhists and the Jews and the And one thing that we can do is to try to build more places for nuanced discussion and not framing things as black and white so much. So that's kind of one way to come in.
Thank you very much. One of you four guys, you can arm wrestle. Ed, you're the tallest.
This is more of a background question, but Aaron, you're talking about how there's no way right now for someone from Central America to legally get here. How do we get to that situation where people come from Europe and Asia can get here legally, people from Central and South America can't?
Did you hear this in the back? Could you hear? Okay.
How do we get here? I'm not sure the answer to your question, but let me take a stab at it. I think as the need for certain jobs has evolved, the law hasn't evolved with it. So, for example, we talked about the migrant worker visa. For example, back in the 70s and 80s, my understanding of the poultry industry here was primarily, the lines were primarily staffed by females, primarily from West Virginia. And there was, in the early 80s, some sort of, I don't think it was a formal strike, but my understanding is there was some sort of a work stoppage or something where the ladies were demanding some changes in their conditions. And the poultry industry, at that point, discovered some Hispanic workers that were here on migrant visas and started working. And they ended up not moving away from that type of employee, the female from West Virginia stereotype, and started the friends. I'll make it passive voice. The friends of the Central Americans started coming, whether it was organized by the poultry industry or not. I'm not going to make that accusation here, but they started coming in. Before long, it became primarily Central American, and so my impression is that rather than the law evolving with the need. Or the opportunities started, and the law just never caught up with it. Does that make sense?
We have time for one more question. Someone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question?
My name is Basil.
His name is David Cooper. He lives in Stanton. And he used to work for the State Department, I think. Okay. He's an immigrant to Harrisonburg.
I think one of the remarkable characteristics of the civil society we find ourselves in the midst of is the amount of benign neglect that helps to support the illegal immigrants among us. And when you think about it, all the hospital workers, all the teachers, all the social workers who don't report everyone they're suspicious of. Newspapers love to make sensational stories, and surely they could make a lot of them by going and rooting out people they suspect of being illegal immigrants. Even our elected officials in town could run on a platform of let's find these folks and let's persecute them, let's drive them away. And it's encouraging to me that there is this unspoken, if you like, kind of civil movement that seeks to accommodate the people who don't have the legal paperwork to be here. It's different in Harrisonburg than it is in, let's say, Georgia, where, as we know today, I believe this Georgia state legislature enacted a piece of legislation that, in my view, actively persecutes.
Are you talking about the law in Alabama that when they pull you over, they can check for your immigration status?
Right.
Yeah, it's Alabama.
Yeah. So by comparison, embraces the stranger among us.
I think that's right. I think it's more than just the industries that are here. I think it's that Harrisonburg has done a very good job, with a few exceptions, of assimilating and of dealing with this issue. I think the city's schools are a great model, and I think other school systems are now coming to Harrisonburg to see how we did it. If you think about how homogenous Harrisonburg was 30 years ago and where we are today, that the fact that change has occurred without a whole lot of strife or difficulty is actually quite amazing. And I think someday there'll be stories written about that, because I think it's actually quite amazing. And I think your comment spoke to that as well. And I think that there's some exceptions to that. I think that ways law enforcement has dealt with it has been problematic at times, with the 287G program the sheriff's office has adopted, and some other things. But by and large, particularly when we think of the churches and we think of the schools and we think of the neighborhoods, Harrisonburg has done, I think, a very good job. Not that there's no room for improvement, but I think that it's commendable.
My wife and I moved here from the Deep South a year and a half ago, born and raised in rural Louisiana and in Houston. And one of the things that struck us most profoundly about Harrisonburg is the rapid change of the society here, from being a homogeneous society, from 4% to 47% ESL in the public schools in around 10 or 15 years. I grew up in communities where if that had happened, there would have been serious social expressions. And there were. And so it's quite remarkable that this community has absorbed a rapid diversification so peaceably on kind of larger levels. Now, clearly the issues are complex and concrete, right? They're not only complex, they're not abstract. They're concrete issues. I think it boils down, for me as a Christian, to this question: how should a society deal with those people who are unable to protect themselves from the depredations of others? The most vulnerable among us. That's the argument used by conservative Christians with regard to abortion. I think the same logic applies to this issue. How should a society respond to those who are unable to protect themselves from the depredations of others? I want to kind of wrap up our time together with a couple of things. A friend of mine is doing scholarly research. He's a PhD guy on this whole issue. And he's written in an article recently about 3 basic attitudes that we should adopt in responding to the most vulnerable in the category of the illegal immigrant. His first challenge, and he's a Canadian, so if you don't like it, you can blame it on the hat. You know, have you seen that T-shirt, America with a hat? That's Canada. Anyway, being non-Canadian, I thought it was funny. First, he says generosity. That part of our response needs to be along the lines of this: we've got to replace the all too common myth of scarcity that fills our satiated culture. There's a myth of scarcity that's being perpetrated in the debates right now that's fueling xenophobia, right? He says that we've got to replace this all too common myth of scarcity that inhabits a satiated culture. That's the irony. We've got to replace that with an assurance that we have enough to live and we have enough to be generous. Now that's a very hard strike at the knees of this debate. His second challenge is that we need an attitude of thanksgiving. And then he says, a life of thanksgiving flows from the knowledge of the reality that we live in a land of plenty. When you replace the myth of scarcity with an assurance that we have enough, this thanksgiving follows. And he says thanksgiving is when you hold your life and the world before you as a gift. And this is at odds with the self-made man myth and the posture of grasping that dominates our culture. Number 3, he says that we need to develop an attitude of inclusion. Now, he's not picking a political side or a theological side on this issue. What he's saying is something Paul talked about earlier. At the heart of a Christian view is the idea that God is Trinity. And the idea that God is Trinity is the idea that God exists in context of hospitality. That's a very long issue, but it boils down to this. Our lives, our land, our possessions, and even our families are gifts. They are given to us and through us to the world. So, I challenge you as you move out from here, whatever side of the political equation you land on, to embrace generosity, thanksgiving, and inclusion. Now, let me remind you, in wrapping things up, that we're going to continue our time. You're welcome to coffee. Is there decaffeinated coffee for types who need such? There is decaffeinated coffee. There's water. There's cookies. Please continue the conversation. You can assault Paul and Aaron with all of your slanderous and fantastic remarks back there. They both said they would stay until midnight. If you would like to join the Café Veritas mailing list, typically these events are held in town. We have them in the basement of Clementine and Court Square Theater. If you would like to join the mailing list, please sign up on one of the forms at the table out there. I promise you we will not send you propaganda for anything but Café Veritas. We won't sell the email address. We won't use it for church stuff. It's a Café Veritas only mailing list. We would love to let you know about future events. We plan to offer 2 to 3 in the fall, 2 to 3 each spring. The location changes. If you would like to hear more, then I encourage you to give us that. So with that being said, thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Paul. We appreciate it. One last thing. Basil and Barbara Finnegan are here. If you can raise your hand. Thank you, David, for not raising your hand. Their son, Brent Finnegan, produced, directed, and wrote The Latino Underground. It's a 1-hour documentary of sorts that came through the program at WVPT called Virginia Reports. I don't know if Virginia Reports is still a thing. You can buy it from WVPT for $17. It's called The Latino Underground. And it's a very good expose of Harrisonburg's Central American population, reasons they're here, and what life is like for them. So you can also check it out from the public library. Thanks very much. Please stick around. We'll see you again.